Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. In tonight's story, an exhausted merchant accepts dinner from a friendly old mountain lady. Spoiler alert, she's not that friendly, and that wasn't chicken. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I would love to connect with you guys. Now, let's dive into tonight's story together. The mountain stood alone beneath a pale and restless sky, its peaks shrouded in mist that moved like breath through the rocky passes. The valleys below had long since shed their summer green, trading vibrant life for the muted palette of approaching winter. Brown grasses bent beneath winds that carried the promise of snow, and the last leaves clung to branches with desperate tenacity, knowing their fall was inevitable. The mountain itself seemed to exist outside the normal passage of seasons, its upper reaches perpetually locked in a state between autumn's death and winter's sleep. Time moved differently in those heights, stretching and contracting like breath, and those who ventured there often spoke of hours that felt like days, or days that passed in moments. The merchant had been traveling for 3 weeks when he reached the mountain's base, his feet carrying him along roads that grew progressively more remote, more forgotten. The larger highways had given way to village paths, and village paths to trading routes, and trading routes finally to trails that existed more as suggestion than reality. Each settlement he passed through was smaller than the last, the people more reserved, their eyes holding a wariness that spoke of isolation and the knowledge that help, should disaster strike, was far away and slow to arrive. In the final village before the mountain proper began, an old man had approached him at the inn where he lodged. The man's face was a map of wrinkles, each line earned through decades of mountain life, and his hands shook as he gripped the merchant's sleeve. He spoke of the high paths in a voice that trembled with something beyond age, something that might have been remembered fear. He described travelers who had gone up and never returned, not all at once but scattered across years, a steady attrition that the villagers marked and mourned but could not explain or prevent. The merchant had listened politely, thanking the old man for his concern, but in his heart he dismissed the warnings as the superstitions of isolated people who saw threats in every shadow. He was a practical man, accustomed to evaluating risks through the lens of commerce and experience. Bandits were real, storms were real, dangerous animals were real, but spirits and demons belonged to stories told to children, not to the world of trade and travel where he made his living. Now, as he climbed higher into the mountain's embrace, his confidence began to erode like soil in heavy rain. The atmosphere here was wrong in ways he could not articulate, as though the mountain itself were alive and aware, watching his progress with interest that was neither benign nor overtly hostile, but simply present. The stones beneath his feet seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, creating pockets of silence so profound that his own heartbeat became thunderous in his ears. Few travelers dared venture into those heights, where the air grew thin and the paths wound through stone corridors carved by ancient winds. The villagers in the valley below spoke in hushed voices of the mountain secrets, of sounds that carried down on winter nights, of shapes that moved against the fog. They warned their children to stay clear of the high trails, where the world grew strange and the boundaries between the living and the spirits blurred like ink in water. On a cold autumn evening, as the sun bled pale light across the western ridges, a lone traveler began the ascent into those forgotten heights. He was a merchant, carrying bolts of silk and small treasures wrapped in oilcloth, bound for a distant town on the mountain's far side. The journey was long, and the direct route through the peaks would save him 3 days of walking along the safer valley roads. He had heard the warnings, of course, but necessity pressed harder than superstition. His worn straw sandals whispered against the stone as he climbed, his breath misting in the cooling air. The path narrowed as he rose higher, the vegetation thinning to twisted pines that clung to the rocky slopes with gnarled roots. Moss grew thick on the shadowed stones, and the air carried the scent of earth and dampness, of places where sunlight seldom reached. The merchant paused at intervals to rest, setting down his pack and listening to the silence that seemed to deepen with each step upward. It was not the simple quiet of an empty place, but something heavier, as though the mountain itself held its breath and watched with hidden eyes. As dusk approached, the fog thickened, rolling up from unseen valleys to wrap the trail in gray wool. The merchant quickened his pace, knowing that nightfall in these heights brought dangers beyond mere cold. Wolves roamed the upper slopes, and there were older things as well, spirits that belonged to the stone and shadow, entities that fed on loneliness and fear. He pulled his thin jacket tighter and pressed forward, searching for any sign of shelter where he might wait out the darkness. The path turned sharply around a massive boulder, and the merchant found himself facing a narrow ravine where water once flowed. The dry stream bed led upward between walls of black rock, disappearing into the mist ahead. He hesitated, uncertain whether to follow this uncertain route or continue along the main trail that seemed to vanish into nothingness. The fog pressed close now, limiting his vision to a few paces in any direction. Every sound seemed amplified in that gray stillness, the scrape of his sandals, the rustle of fabric, the beating of his own heart. Then, cutting through the silence like a blade, came a voice. It was thin and high, wavering like wind through hollow reeds, calling out words he could not quite distinguish. The merchant froze, straining to hear. The voice came again, clearer now, speaking in the old dialect of the mountain people, offering welcome and shelter. Relief flooded through him, warm against the growing cold. Someone lived in these heights, a hermit perhaps, or a family keeping to the old ways. He called back, announcing himself as a traveler in need of rest. The voice guided him forward, leading him up the dry stream bed, where stones lay smooth and pale like bones in the fading light. The walls of the ravine rose higher on either side, blocking what little remained of the day's illumination. The merchant moved carefully, testing each step, following the voice that seemed to drift ahead of him through the mist. It spoke of warmth, of food and tea, of a place where he could rest his weary body and wait for morning. The words wrapped around him like a promise, soft and insistent. The ravine opened suddenly into a small clearing where the rock walls fell back and the ground leveled beneath scattered pines. In the center of this space, barely visible through the fog, stood a crude dwelling built against the mountain's face. It was ancient, constructed of weathered timber and stone, with a thatched roof that sagged under the weight of years. Smoke rose from a hole in the roof, gray on gray, and a dim light flickered behind a paper screen that covered the doorway. The merchant approached slowly, his merchant's caution stirring even as his body craved the warmth that radiated from within. The door slid open before he could knock, and a figure emerged into the twilight. She was old, impossibly old, bent double beneath the weight of uncounted years. Her face was a landscape of wrinkles, deep as mountain crevasses, and her eyes were small and dark as winter berries. She wore robes of faded indigo, patched and repatched until the original fabric was lost beneath layers of repair. Her hands, twisted with age, gestured him inside with urgent hospitality. The merchant bowed, offering thanks in the formal manner, and stepped across the threshold into warmth and firelight. The interior was small, a single room with a hearth at its center where embers glowed red beneath a blackened kettle. Straw mats covered the earthen floor, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a sharp, medicinal scent. The old woman gestured for him to set down his burden and rest. She moved with surprising quickness for one so ancient, shuffling to the fire and stirring whatever simmered in the kettle. As the merchant settled onto the mat, removing his sandals and arranging his pack beside him, he studied his host more carefully. There was something unsettling about her movements, a quality he could not quite name. Her hands, despite their gnarled appearance, moved with fluid precision, and when she turned to face him, her smile revealed teeth too numerous and too sharp for comfort. Yet the warmth was real, and the smell of cooking food made his stomach clench with hunger. He had not eaten since morning, and the cold had driven deep into his bones during the climb. The old woman ladled soup into a wooden bowl and passed it to him with both hands, bowing low. The merchant accepted it gratefully, breathing in the steam that rose from the surface. The broth was dark and rich, filled with mushrooms and mountain vegetables he could not identify. He sipped carefully, finding it delicious, savory, and complex, warming him from within. The old woman watched him eat with those small, dark eyes, nodding in satisfaction as he drained the bowl. She refilled it without being asked, pressing him to eat more, to restore his strength after the difficult climb. They sat in silence as the night deepened beyond the paper door. The merchant finished a second bowl and set it aside, his exhaustion beginning to pull at him like weighted nets. The old woman prepared tea, pouring it into small clay cups with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. The liquid was pale green and bitter, but the merchant drank it without complaint, knowing the mountain people valued such courtesies. The woman spoke little, only occasional words about the weather, about the difficulty of the paths, about the loneliness of living so high above the world. As the tea worked its way through his system, the merchant felt a strange lassitude spreading through his limbs. His thoughts grew slow and thick, and the firelight seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. The old woman's face, illuminated from below by the glowing embers, took on a quality both ancient and alien, as though she were carved from the mountain itself, a thing of stone given temporary flesh. Her smile never wavered, and her eyes never left his face, watching with an intensity that should have alarmed him, but instead only made him drowsier. The merchant's head nodded forward, and he jerked awake, fighting the pull of sleep. In his dreams, the merchant walked through landscapes that never existed, and always had existed, places where the rules of waking reality held no authority. He was in the cave again, but the cave was also a forest, and the forest was also the interior of some vast creature, whose rib cage formed the trees, and whose breath was the wind. The bones he walked among were singing, each one producing a single note that combined with all the others into a harmony that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The old woman was there too, but she wore many faces, cycling through them like a mask dancer in a festival. Sometimes she was young and lovely, with skin like porcelain and eyes that promised understanding. Sometimes she was ancient beyond comprehension, a thing of withered flesh stretched over jutting bone. And sometimes she was not human at all, but a shape that his sleeping mind could not fully process, a geometry that existed in too many dimensions, angles that folded into impossible configurations. She spoke to him in that dream, and though her words were in languages he had never learned, their meaning arrived in his consciousness fully formed. She told him of hunger, the kind that went beyond mere physical need into something more fundamental. It was the hunger of existence itself, the drive to continue, to persist, to consume whatever was necessary for survival. She had been many things, she told him, before she became what she was now. Once, perhaps, she had been human, a woman who made choices and lived a life defined by more than appetite. But time and circumstance and the mountain's influence had worn away everything except the essential need. The merchant wanted to ask questions, wanted to understand how such a transformation occurred, whether it was gradual or sudden, whether she mourned what she had lost or embraced what she had become. But his dream tongue could not form words, and he could only listen as she continued her monologue, speaking of centuries spent in those high places, of the slow parade of victims who had nourished her existence, of the loneliness that came with being a solitary predator in a world that had moved beyond belief in such things. When he woke, gasping in the gray dawn, fragments of that dream clung to his consciousness like cobwebs. He could not remember the specifics, but the emotional residue remained, a mixture of pity and horror that left him unsettled and confused. How could he feel sympathy for a creature that intended to devour him? Yet in the dream, she had seemed almost tragic, a being trapped by her nature, as surely as any prey was trapped by circumstance. But the warmth, the food, the tea, the exhaustion of the climb, all conspired to drag him down into darkness. His last conscious thought was of those teeth, too many and too sharp, and the way the firelight cast shadows that moved against the walls like living things. Then sleep claimed him completely, pulling him deep into dreams, where he walked through endless caves beneath the mountain, following a voice that called his name in the language of stones. The merchant woke to gray light filtering through the paper door, his body stiff and cold despite the blanket that had been draped over him during the night. The fire had burned down to ash, and the air in the small dwelling carried a chill that made his breath visible. He sat up slowly, his mind foggy with the remnants of strange dreams, and looked around for his host. The old woman was not present, though her sleeping mat in the corner showed signs of recent use. He rose carefully, his joints protesting, and moved to the door. Sliding it open, he stepped out into a morning transformed by mist. The fog had grown denser overnight, reducing visibility to mere arm's length. The clearing where the dwelling stood seemed to float in a gray void, disconnected from the world above and below. The pines were invisible, their presence marked only by vague shadows in the surrounding whiteness. No sound broke the silence, no bird call or wind whisper, nothing but the merchant's own breathing and the soft scrape of his movements. He called out for the old woman, his voice swallowed by the fog almost before it left his lips. No answer came. The merchant frowned, troubled by her absence and by the unnatural quality of the morning. He had intended to leave early, to continue his journey before the mountain claimed too much of the day, but the fog made travel impossible. Without seeing the path, he would wander in circles, or worse, step over some unseen edge to tumble down the rocky slopes below. With reluctance, he returned to the dwelling and busied himself with rekindling the fire. He found a small store of wood stacked beside the hearth and used his flint to coax flames from the cold ashes. As warmth began to spread through the room again, the merchant examined his surroundings more carefully in the growing light. What he had taken for bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters revealed themselves as something stranger upon closer inspection. They were plants, certainly, but varieties he did not recognize, their leaves shaped like claws, and their dried flowers resembling small skulls. The medicinal scent he had noticed the night before now seemed less pleasant, carrying undertones of decay and bitter earth. The walls, too, showed peculiarities he had missed in the dim firelight. Dark stains marked the timbers near the floor, and scratches scored the wood in patterns that might have been writing in some ancient script, or simply the marks of claws seeking purchase. The earthen floor, swept clean but worn smooth by countless footsteps, showed depressions that suggested the dwelling had stood here far longer than its decrepit appearance implied. This was not the simple hermitage of a mountain recluse, but something older, something that had witnessed more years than any human life could span. The merchant's unease grew as he waited for the old woman's return. He checked his pack, relieved to find nothing disturbed, his silk and treasures intact. Yet something felt wrong, a quality to the silence that pressed against his ears like water pressure. He moved to the door again and peered out into the unchanging fog. Hours seemed to pass, though the gray light never shifted, never brightened or dimmed. Time itself seemed suspended in this high place, trapped between earth and sky. Finally, as the merchant was considering the risk of attempting to navigate the fog, he heard movement outside. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a sound like something heavy being dragged across stone. The merchant tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the small knife at his belt. The paper door slid open, and the old woman entered, her robes damp with mist, her small eyes gleaming in the firelight. She carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, which she set down near the hearth with unexpected care. Without speaking, she began to prepare another meal, moving between the bundle and the kettle with practiced efficiency. The merchant watched, trying to discern what she had brought from outside, but the cloth concealed its contents completely. The smell that rose when she unwrapped it was rich and gamey, like venison or wild boar, and soon the small dwelling filled with the aroma of cooking meat. The old woman served him again, pressing food upon him with insistent hospitality. The merchant ate, though his appetite had diminished. The meat was tender and flavorful, but something about its texture troubled him, a quality he could not quite identify. He forced himself to finish what she had given, not wanting to offend his host, especially while trapped by the fog in this isolated place. As they ate, the old woman began to speak more freely than she had the previous night. Her voice was thin but clear, and she told him stories of the mountain, of the spirits that dwelled in its heights, of travelers who had passed through over the years. Some had stayed, she said, finding peace in the solitude and the simple life. Others had continued on their way, carrying tales of the kindly hermit who offered shelter to those in need. Her words painted a picture of benevolent isolation, of a life lived in harmony with the harsh mountain environment. Yet beneath her words, the merchant sensed currents he could not fathom. The way she spoke of the travelers who had stayed suggested something permanent, something final. And when she mentioned the spirits of the mountain, her small eyes seemed to reflect lights that did not come from the fire. He found himself studying her hands as she gestured, noting how the twisted fingers moved with that same unsettling grace, how the nails were thick and yellowed and curved like talons. The fog persisted throughout the day, showing no signs of lifting. The merchant paced the small dwelling, his restlessness growing with each passing hour. The old woman seemed unconcerned, going about small tasks with patient efficiency. She mended a torn robe, ground herbs in a stone mortar, sang softly to herself in a language the merchant did not recognize. When he asked about the fog, whether it might clear by evening, she shrugged and said that the mountain kept its own time, that weather here followed no rules understood by valley dwellers. As darkness approached once more, the merchant felt a creeping dread settling over him. The thought of spending another night in this place, of drinking more of that bitter tea, and falling into those deep, dream-haunted sleeps, filled him with a fear he could not rationalize. He had been treated with nothing but kindness, fed and sheltered without request for payment, yet every instinct screamed at him to leave, to flee into the fog if necessary, to put distance between himself and this ancient dwelling, and its too gracious host. But night fell before he could summon the courage to act on his fear, and the fog grew even denser in the darkness, a tangible barrier against escape. The old woman prepared tea again, and the merchant drank it, feeling that familiar heaviness creeping through his limbs. This time, he fought against it, pinching himself to stay awake, biting his tongue until he tasted blood. The old woman watched him with those unreadable eyes, her smile never faltering. In the firelight, as sleep pulled at him despite his resistance, the merchant saw something that made his blood run cold. The shadows on the wall behind the old woman seemed to move independently of her body, writhing and stretching like living things, and in those shadows, he glimpsed shapes that suggested not the bent form of an ancient woman, but something larger, something with too many limbs and a mouth that opened wide enough to swallow the moon. He blinked, and the vision passed, but the image burned in his mind as darkness claimed him once more. The merchant woke abruptly, his heart racing, pulled from sleep by some sound he could not identify. The dwelling was dark except for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. The old woman's sleeping mat was empty again, and through the paper door came a thin light that suggested dawn, or possibly moonlight filtered through the persistent fog. He lay still, listening, every sense straining against the silence. Then he heard it again, a sound like stone grinding against stone, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. It was rhythmic, purposeful, the sound of something being moved or worked. The merchant rose silently, careful not to disturb the blanket, and crept to the door. He eased it open a crack and peered out into the gray-lit morning. The fog had thinned slightly, enough to reveal shapes and distances. The clearing was empty, but at its far edge, where the rock face of the mountain rose sheer and dark, he saw an opening he had not noticed before. It was a cave mouth, partially concealed by a jutting overhang, and from within came that grinding sound and a flickering light that suggested flame. Without conscious decision, the merchant found himself moving toward it, drawn by a need to understand, to see what his host did in the hours when her guests slept. He approached the cave opening carefully, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to pass through sideways, but beyond it, the passage opened into a larger space. The grinding sound had stopped, replaced now by a low humming, a tuneless song in that same ancient language the old woman sometimes used. The merchant pressed himself against the rock wall and peered around the edge of the opening. What he saw froze him in place, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene illuminated by the torchlight within. The cave was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, its floor covered with pale objects that gleamed dully in the flickering light. Bones, countless bones arranged in piles and patterns, skulls staring with empty sockets, rib cages arching like bridges over smaller fragments. And among them moved the old woman, or rather, something that wore her shape like an ill-fitting garment. She was larger in the cave, her bent form straightening to reveal a height that should have been impossible for someone so aged. Her robes hung loose, revealing limbs that were too long, joints that bent in ways that defied human anatomy. As the merchant watched in horror, she selected bones from the piles with careful deliberation, examining each piece before adding it to a basket at her feet. Her movements were methodical, practiced, the actions of someone performing a familiar task. The basket was nearly full, and as the creature that appeared to be an old woman lifted it, preparing to leave the cave, the merchant saw what lay at the bottom. The bones varied in age, some ancient and yellowed, crumbling at their edges, others newer, still bearing stains that the merchant's mind refused to identify. He could see evidence of careful organization in how they were arranged, skulls grouped by size, long bones sorted by type, smaller fragments collected in carved wooden bowls. This was not the random accumulation of a mindless predator, but a collection maintained with almost scholarly attention to detail. Near the back of the cave, partially hidden by shadow, the merchant noticed something else that made his breath catch. Stone shelves had been carved into the wall, and on these shelves sat objects that had clearly belonged to the victims. A child's wooden toy, worn smooth by small hands. A woman's comb, still holding strands of long black hair. A man's pipe, its bowl blackened by years of use. Each item was placed with care, arranged not as trophies but as, what? Remembrances? Evidence of lives ended? The merchant could not say, but their presence added a dimension to the horror that was somehow worse than the bones themselves. These had been people, individuals with histories and families and dreams, reduced now to calcium and memory. The toy suggested a family traveling together, perhaps fleeing hardship in one region for hoped-for prosperity in another. The comb spoke of vanity, or simply care for appearance, of mornings spent preparing oneself for the day ahead. The pipe indicated age, habit, the small comforts that made difficult lives bearable. All of it ended here, in this cave, consumed by hunger that wore a kindly face until the trap was sprung. Fresh bones, still bearing traces of meat, wrapped in the same cloth she had carried into the dwelling the previous morning. Understanding crashed over him like cold water. The meals she had served, the tender meat he had eaten, the rich flavor he had thought was venison. His stomach heaved, and he pressed his hand over his mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape. The creature turned toward the cave entrance, and the merchant scrambled backward, his mind screaming at him to run. But years of traveling had taught him caution, and he forced himself to move slowly, to make no sound that would alert her to his discovery. He slipped back across the clearing, his heart hammering so hard he feared it would burst, and eased himself back into the dwelling. He arranged himself on his mat, pulling the blanket over his shaking body, and closed his eyes just as he heard her footsteps approaching the door. She entered quietly, setting down the basket with barely a sound. The merchant kept his breathing slow and even, feigning sleep, though every muscle in his body was tense with the effort. He heard her moving about the room, stirring the fire, preparing the morning meal. The smell that rose from the kettle now made his stomach turn, knowing what he knew, understanding what she was. An Onibaba, a demon hag. The stories he had dismissed as superstition were real, and he was trapped here with her, fed and fattened like livestock awaiting slaughter. How many travelers had she lured to this high place? How many had eaten from her pot, drunk her drugged tea, and never woken from their sleep? The bones in the cave represented years, perhaps centuries, of victims, all of them trusting in her appearance of kindness, in the universal human need for shelter and warmth. The merchant knew he had to act, had to find a way to escape before she decided he had served his purpose. But the fog still pressed against the dwelling, and he had no knowledge of the paths through these heights. She had the advantage of terrain, of familiarity, of supernatural strength and endurance. He was just a man, tired and far from home, armed with nothing but a small knife and his wits. As morning fully arrived and the old woman called to him to wake and eat, the merchant forced himself to rise and smile and accept the bowl she offered. But he did not eat, merely pretended to, while she busied herself with other tasks. When she left the dwelling again, muttering something about gathering water, he took his chance. He dumped the contents of the bowl into the fire, watching it hiss and steam, then moved quickly to examine the small space for anything that might help him. In a corner, hidden beneath a pile of old robes, he found items that had belonged to previous victims. A pilgrim's staff, weathered and cracked, prayer beads carved from wood, a small mirror in a tarnished frame, and most significantly, a map, drawn on thin paper, showing the mountain paths and marking the location of the dwelling. The merchant studied it quickly, memorizing the routes, noting a path that led not back down the way he had come, but through a narrow pass to the mountain's eastern side. He returned everything to its place except the map, which he folded and tucked inside his jacket. When the old woman returned, he was sitting by the fire, his expression innocent, his manner unchanged. But inside, his mind was working, planning, calculating odds and distances. He would need to wait for the right moment, when the fog lifted enough to navigate, when she was distracted, or perhaps sleeping. He would need to move quickly and without hesitation, because there would be no second chance. The day passed with agonizing slowness. The merchant maintained his pretense of trust, accepting food he did not eat, drinking tea he only pretended to swallow while she was not looking. He asked questions about the mountain, about the paths, about the weather, gathering information while trying not to reveal his knowledge. The old woman answered patiently, her small eyes never leaving his face, and he wondered if she could sense his deception, if she knew what he had seen in the cave. As evening approached, the fog began to thin. The merchant could see the outlines of trees in the clearing now, could distinguish individual rocks and depressions in the ground. The wind had picked up, carrying that gray veil away in streamers and patches. By morning, he estimated, visibility would be good enough to risk travel. He just had to survive one more night, one more round of drugged tea and watchful eyes. When darkness fell, the old woman prepared their evening meal and the inevitable tea. The merchant had developed a technique for appearing to drink while actually holding the liquid in his mouth, then spitting it into his sleeve when she was not looking. But tonight, as she handed him the cup, she watched him with particular intensity, her gaze fixed on his throat as if she could see the swallow or lack thereof. The merchant felt sweat break out on his forehead but forced himself to remain calm. He drank, truly drank this time, feeling the bitter liquid slide down his throat, and cursed inwardly as the familiar heaviness began to spread through his body. His plan crumbled as consciousness slipped away. The old woman's smile widened, revealing all those sharp teeth, and her voice seemed to come from very far away as she spoke words he could no longer understand. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was her hand reaching toward his face, those twisted fingers ending in nails that had become true claws, and he knew with terrible certainty that he would not wake naturally from this sleep. But consciousness did return, though not as he expected. The merchant found himself aware but unable to move, his body heavy as stone, his eyes refusing to open despite his desperate efforts. He could hear, though, and what he heard filled him with a terror so profound that his paralyzed heart should have stopped. The old woman was speaking, not to him, but to herself, and her voice had changed. It was deeper now, resonant with age that went beyond human reckoning, and the language she used was ancient, predating the villages in the valleys, perhaps predating humanity itself. He felt himself being moved, lifted with surprising strength, and carried through the doorway into the cold night air. The fog was gone completely now, and through his closed eyelids he sensed starlight, bright and pitiless. She carried him across the clearing, and he knew where she was taking him, knew with absolute certainty that he was being brought to the cave to join the others who had trusted and died in this high place. The passage through the narrow entrance scraped his shoulders, and then the air changed, becoming colder, damper, filled with the smell of stone and old death. She set him down, not gently, and he heard her moving away, heard the scratch of flint, and saw the glow through his eyelids as she lit torches. The cave filled with wavering light, and shadows danced across the bones, making them seem to shift and writhe. The old woman began to hum again, that tuneless song, and the merchant felt her hands on him, checking his pulse, testing the weight of his limbs. She spoke, and though the language was foreign, the intent was clear. She was deciding how to proceed, what tools to use, where to make the first cut. The merchant's mind screamed at his body to move, to fight, to do anything, but the tea had paralyzed him completely. He was awake but helpless, aware but incapable of response, trapped in his own flesh like a prisoner in a cell. Then something unexpected happened. As the old woman moved away to select her tools, as her attention shifted from her victim to her preparations, the merchant felt a tingling in his fingers. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. The drug, whatever combination of mountain herbs she had used, was powerful, but perhaps not as long-lasting as she assumed. Or perhaps his earlier pretense at drinking, his half-swallowed doses, meant he had consumed less than she believed. Either way, sensation was returning, creeping up his arms like fire ants, painful but welcome. He forced himself to remain still, to maintain the appearance of complete paralysis, while internally he focused every shred of will on reclaiming control of his body. His fingers twitched, his toes curled, his eyelids fluttered open just a crack, enough to see the cave around him, to see the old woman bent over her tools, her back turned. He was lying on a flat stone, worn smooth by repeated use, and around him the bones of her previous victims seemed to watch with hollow accusation. The merchant's right hand was near the edge of the stone, and as feeling returned to his arm, he slowly, incrementally, began to move it. The motion was clumsy, his muscles responding poorly, but he managed to close his fingers around a piece of stone that had chipped away from his resting place. It was small, but sharp, roughly triangular, and its weight in his palm gave him a measure of desperate hope. The old woman was chanting now, her voice rising and falling in patterns that suggested ritual. This was not simple murder to her, but something sacred, a ceremony performed countless times, a sacrament of hunger and survival. She turned toward him, and in her hands she held a blade, crude but wickedly sharp, its edge glinting in the torchlight. Her face had changed fully now, no longer maintaining even the pretense of human features. Her jaw had elongated, revealing rows of needle teeth, and her eyes had grown larger, reflecting light like an animal's. This was her true form, the shape she wore in privacy, the demon beneath the human mask. She approached the stone where he lay, and the merchant knew his time had run out. If he was going to act, it had to be now, regardless of his partial paralysis, regardless of the odds against success. As she raised the blade, beginning the first gesture of her ritual, the merchant's body suddenly obeyed his desperate command. He rolled sideways off the stone, falling heavily to the cave floor among the bones, and swept his makeshift weapon toward her legs. The sharp stone caught her ankle, cutting deep, and the creature that had been an old woman howled in surprise and rage. The sound was inhuman, echoing through the cave and beyond, a noise that made the very rocks shudder. But the merchant had no time to process his fear. He scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady, his movements uncoordinated, and ran for the cave entrance. Behind him, he heard her recovering, heard the scrape of claws on stone as she gave chase. He burst through the narrow opening into the starlit clearing, gasping for breath, his heart thundering. The cold air hit his face like a slap, clearing some of the fog from his mind. He could see the path now, illuminated by moonlight, the route marked on the stolen map burned into his memory. East, through the narrow pass, down the far slope where settlements lay. But it was miles away, and she was faster, stronger, more familiar with the terrain. The merchant ran anyway, because the alternative was death. He plunged into the darkness beyond the clearing, following the path by feel as much as sight, his hands outstretched to catch himself when he stumbled. Behind him, growing closer, came the sounds of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something else, something that moved across stone with a skittering, insect-like gait. And her voice, no longer high and thin but deep and resonant, calling out in that ancient language, words that might have been curses or commands or simply expressions of frustrated hunger. The path narrowed, becoming little more than a ledge along the mountain's face. On one side, rock rose sheer and impassable. On the other, darkness dropped away into unseen depths. The merchant pressed himself against the stone wall and moved sideways, his feet testing each step before committing his weight. The sounds of pursuit echoed strangely in this confined space, making it impossible to judge distance. She could be mere feet behind him or still at the clearing's edge, and he would not know until he felt her claws in his flesh. Then the path opened into a wider area, a natural platform where pilgrims had once built a small shrine. It was ruins now. The wooden structure collapsed and rotted, but the stone altar remained, carved with protective symbols from an era when people still believed such things held power. The merchant stumbled toward it, his legs finally giving out, and collapsed against the cold stone. His lungs burned, his vision swam, and every muscle trembled with exhaustion. He heard her emerge onto the platform, heard the wet rasp of her breathing, the click of claws on stone. She was no longer running, no longer hurrying. The chase was over, and they both knew it. The merchant turned, his back against the altar, and faced her. In the moonlight, she was fully revealed, the last vestiges of human form stripped away. She was tall and gaunt, her limbs too long and jointed in too many places, her skin gray as stone and just as rough. Her mouth split her face nearly in half, and those teeth, those terrible teeth, gleamed wet in the silver light. She spoke, and though her voice was monstrous now, the merchant understood her meaning, if not her words. She was old, older than the mountains themselves, perhaps. and this was her territory, her hunting ground. He had entered knowing the risks, or should have known, and now the price would be paid. It was nothing personal, nothing cruel, simply the natural order of predator and prey in this high place where human laws and moralities held no sway. The merchant's hand closed around his small knife, the blade he had carried for cutting rope and opening packages, utterly inadequate against the creature before him. But it was all he had, and he would not die passive and helpless. If this was his end, he would at least face it with whatever courage he could muster. He raised the knife, knowing it was futile, knowing that she could tear him apart before he managed a single strike. The Onibaba tensed, preparing to spring, and the merchant closed his eyes, not wanting his last sight to be those teeth descending. But the impact never came. Instead, a sound split the night, a deep gong-like note that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. The merchant's eyes snapped open in time to see the creature recoiling, her clawed hands raised as if to ward off a blow. The symbols carved into the altar stone were glowing, faint but definite, pulsing with a light that had nothing to do with moon or stars. The old protective magic, dormant for generations, had stirred at his desperate touch. The Onibaba hissed, her form rippling, becoming less substantial. She could not approach the altar while the symbols held, could not cross that barrier of ancient power. For a long moment, she and the merchant stared at each other across the space of a few feet that might as well have been miles. Then, with a final cry of rage and frustration, she turned and fled, her body flowing back into the darkness, becoming shadow and suggestion rather than solid form. The merchant heard her retreat into the heights, heard her call echo one final time across the peaks, a sound that spoke of hunger deferred but not forgotten, of a patience measured in centuries rather than years. The merchant remained against the altar until the first light of dawn began to pale the eastern sky. The protective glow from the symbols had faded quickly after the Onibaba's departure, but he had not dared to move, fearing that she might return, that the magic might have only driven her off temporarily. His body ached from cold and exhaustion, and his mind felt fractured, unable to fully process what he had witnessed, what he had survived. As the sun's first rays touched the highest peaks, painting them gold and rose, the merchant finally pushed himself to his feet. His legs were unsteady, and he had to lean on the altar for support. But eventually, he managed to stand unaided. The narrow path continued eastward, winding down the mountain's far side toward the distant promise of safety. He took a deep breath of the cold morning air, feeling it burn in his lungs, and began to walk. The descent was treacherous, especially in his weakened state. Several times he stumbled, once coming perilously close to the edge where the path overlooked a sheer drop, but fear and determination drove him onward. He could not stay in these heights, could not risk encountering the Onibaba again or succumbing to exposure and exhaustion. He had to reach the lowlands, had to find other people, had to put as much distance as possible between himself and that accursed dwelling. As he descended, the landscape gradually transformed. The bare rock and twisted pines gave way to more substantial forest. The air grew warmer, thicker, easier to breathe. Bird calls broke the silence, and once he startled a family of deer that had been browsing among the underbrush. These ordinary sights and sounds felt miraculous after the nightmare of the previous days, evidence of a normal world that still existed beyond the mountain's malevolent grip. By midday, he reached a stream, the first running water he had encountered since beginning his flight. He drank deeply, the cold water washing away some of the bitter taste that lingered from the Onibaba's tea. He splashed his face and hands, cleaning away the grime of travel and terror, though no amount of water could cleanse his memories. He rested there for a time, listening to the water's simple song, trying to anchor himself in the present moment rather than dwelling on recent horrors. As the afternoon lengthened, the path joined a larger trail, one that showed signs of regular use. The merchant's spirits lifted at this evidence of human activity. Soon he encountered a woodcutter, an elderly man with kind eyes who took one look at the merchant's haggard appearance and offered assistance. The merchant accepted gratefully, and the woodcutter shared his simple meal and gave directions to the nearest village, a place called Higashimura, the eastern village. They walked together for a time, the woodcutter chatting about local matters, about weather and crops and village gossip, ordinary concerns that seemed to belong to a different world than the one the merchant had just escaped. When the woodcutter asked what had brought him to these remote trails, the merchant found himself unable to answer directly. How could he explain what he had experienced? Who would believe tales of demon hags and caves full of bones? Instead, he spoke vaguely of becoming lost in the fog, of spending days wandering the high country before finding his way down. The woodcutter nodded sympathetically, mentioning that the mountain was treacherous, that several travelers had disappeared in those heights over the years. He said it matter-of-factly, as though such losses were simply the price of mountain travel. And the merchant wondered how many of those missing travelers had found their way to that dwelling, how many had contributed bones to that terrible collection. As dusk approached, they reached Higashimura. It was a small settlement, perhaps 30 houses clustered around a central square, where a well provided water for all. The villagers greeted the woodcutter warmly and regarded the merchant with curious but friendly eyes. An innkeeper offered him lodging without payment, insisting that travelers in need were always welcome in Higashimura. The merchant accepted with gratitude bordering on tears, overwhelmed by this simple human kindness after the false hospitality of the Onibaba. That night, sleeping on clean straw in a warm room, with the sounds of normal human life around him, the merchant finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his ordeal. Tears came then, tears of relief and horror and grief for those who had not escaped as he had. He had been incredibly fortunate, saved as much by luck and ancient magic as by his own actions. Countless others had not been so blessed, and their bones remained in that cave, testament to the Onibaba's endless hunger. In the morning, he woke to bright sunlight and the smell of cooking rice. The innkeeper's wife fed him a proper breakfast, hot and nourishing, and asked no uncomfortable questions about his journey. Afterward, he retrieved his pack, relieved to find that everything of value remained. The silk bolts were intact, his small treasures undamaged. He could continue his trading, could resume his journey to the distant town that was his original destination. But as he prepared to leave the village, thanking the innkeeper and his wife, the merchant hesitated. He thought of the other travelers who would come through the mountain pass, drawn by the promise of a shorter route, unaware of the danger that lurked in those heights. He thought of the Onibaba, patient and eternal, waiting for her next victim. Could he simply continue on his way, saying nothing, leaving others to their fate? He sought out the village elder, an ancient woman who reminded him uncomfortably of the Onibaba's human guise, though her eyes held only warmth and wisdom. He told her everything, the whole terrible story, watching her face for signs of disbelief or dismissal. But the elder listened gravely, nodding at intervals, and when he finished, she sighed deeply. She told him that stories of the Onibaba had circulated for generations, though few believed them anymore. In past times, The mountain paths had been marked with warnings, and shrines had been maintained at regular intervals, their protective magic renewed each year by priests and priestesses. But as the old ways faded, as fewer travelers used the high trails, the warnings had been forgotten and the shrines abandoned. What remained was only legend, cautionary tales told to frighten children into obedience. The elder thanked the merchant for his information and promised to send word to neighboring villages to reinstate warnings about the mountain's danger. She could not promise more than that. The Onibaba's dwelling was beyond their reach, protected by terrain and perhaps by magic older than any they could counter. The best they could do was warn others, steer travelers towards safer routes, and hope that the demon hag would eventually grow frustrated by the lack of prey and relocate to some other hunting ground. The merchant stayed in Higashimura for 3 days, recovering his strength and his equilibrium. The villagers treated him with kindness, and several families invited him to share meals, perhaps sensing that he needed human connection to heal the wounds the mountain had inflicted. On the 3rd evening, he participated in a small ceremony at the village shrine, where the elder led prayers for the souls of those who had died in the mountains, for all the travelers who had found not shelter, but death in that high place. As he stood among the villagers, listening to the old prayers being chanted in the flickering light of ceremonial candles, the merchant felt something inside him begin to mend. The terror remained, the memories were still vivid, but they no longer dominated his entire being. He had survived. He had fought and run and been saved by luck and magic, and now he stood among people who believed his story, who honored the dead with him, who offered not judgment, but compassion. When finally he left Higashimura, continuing his journey along the valley road that avoided the mountain entirely, the merchant carried with him more than just silk and treasures. He carried a story, a warning, and a responsibility. At every town and village along his route, he spoke of the Onibaba, of the danger lurking in the high paths. Some listeners dismissed him as mad or attention-seeking, but others nodded grimly, recognizing truth when they heard it, and spread the word further. Years passed. The merchant completed his journey, and many others, always choosing the longer, safer routes through the valleys, never again attempting to save time by crossing the high passes. His business prospered, and eventually he settled in a coastal town, opening a shop that became known for the quality of its silk and the merchant's honest dealings. He married, had children, built a life that was comfortable and secure, but the mountain never entirely released its grip on his spirit. In quiet moments, he would find himself remembering that dwelling, that cave, those bones. The memory of the Onibaba's face, both in its false kindness and its true horror, haunted his dreams. He would wake in darkness, sweating and gasping, convinced he heard her voice calling from the shadows, promising warmth and shelter and death. His wife, a patient woman with strong nerves, learned not to press him about these nightmares. She understood that he carried scars from his traveling days, wounds that time could fade, but never fully heal. She simply held him when the dreams came, anchored him to the present with her warmth and solidity, reminded him that he was safe, that the past was past. The merchant's children grew, and he found himself reluctant to tell them stories of his adventures. Other merchants delighted in regaling their offspring with tales of distant lands and strange encounters. But the merchant spoke of his travels only in the most general terms. His children sensed the omission and sometimes pressed for details, but he deflected their questions with gentle firmness. There were some things, he believed, that should not be shared with the young, some knowledge that carried too much darkness. Only once did he break this self-imposed silence. His eldest daughter, on the verge of womanhood, announced her intention to travel as a peddler, following in her father's footsteps. The merchant's blood ran cold at the thought. His daughter's face cycled through emotions as he spoke, each revelation bringing new expressions of shock, disbelief, and slowly growing acceptance. When he described the teeth, she shuddered. When he recounted the cave of bones, she went pale. And when he reached the moment of the altar's protection, tears began to slip down her cheeks, though whether from relief at his survival or grief for those who had not survived, he could not tell. She asked questions he had anticipated, and some he had not. How did the tea taste? What did the dwelling smell like? Could he see any humanity remaining in the Onibaba's true form, or was it completely alien? He answered as best he could, though some details had faded with time, while others remained vivid with a clarity that suggested they would never fade, branded into his memory like scars. The hardest question came near the end of his account. Do you think she chose to become what she was, or was it done to her? The merchant had pondered this himself over the years, especially in light of those strange dreams from his first night in the dwelling. He told his daughter honestly that he did not know, that perhaps it was both or neither, that transformation into something monstrous might not follow simple paths of choice or coercion, but arise from circumstances too complex for easy understanding. He sat her down and told her the story of the Onibaba, sparing no detail, describing the horror in stark terms. He wanted her to understand the risks, wanted her to know that the world held dangers beyond storms and bandits, that some threats could not be fought with ordinary weapons or avoided by simple caution. His daughter listened silently, her face growing pale, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she asked if he thought she was too weak to face such dangers, if he believed only men could survive in the wider world. The merchant shook his head. It was not about strength or capability, he explained. It was about the randomness of fate, the cruel chance that put one person in the path of a monster while another traveled safely. He had survived through luck as much as skill, and the knowledge of how easily it could have gone differently haunted him still. In the end, his daughter chose a different path. She became a scholar, studying history and folklore, documenting the old stories before they disappeared entirely. She collected accounts of yokai and spirits from across the region, creating a comprehensive record that would survive even after the last person who believed in such things had passed. The merchant contributed to her research, finally writing down the full account of his encounter with the Onibaba, adding it to the growing collection of supernatural testimonies. Reading that written account, seeing his experience transformed into text that others could study and evaluate, gave the merchant a strange sense of relief. It was no longer just his burden to carry. The story had become part of a larger tapestry, a warning and a remembrance for future generations. Perhaps some traveler, reading his words decades or centuries hence, would take a different path, avoid that mountain, survive when otherwise they might have perished. As the merchant aged, his hair turning gray and then white, his strong body growing weaker, he found his thoughts returning more and more to the mountain. He wondered if the Onibaba still dwelt there, still lured travelers to that cave of bones. He wondered if the warnings had been effective, if the protective shrines had been rebuilt, if the high paths were empty now of human life. Part of him hoped the demon hag had starved, deprived of prey by the stories he and others had spread. But a darker part, the part shaped by that terrible encounter, believed she endured still, patient and eternal, her hunger as constant as the stone she inhabited. On his deathbed, surrounded by family in the comfortable house his success had built, the merchant's mind wandered back through the years to that night in the cave. He remembered the terror, yes, but also the clarity of that moment when he chose to fight rather than submit. He remembered the altar's unexpected protection, the ancient magic responding to desperate need. He remembered the dawn that followed, cold and beautiful and promising life. His last words, whispered to his daughter as she held his hand, were not of business or family matters, but of the mountain. He made her promise to keep the story alive, to ensure it remained part of the recorded folklore, to never let future generations forget what lurked in those high places. She promised through tears, and he died peacefully, his duty done, his warning given. The merchant's daughter kept her promise. Her collection of yokai accounts became the foundation for a larger body of work that survives to this day. Scholars study it, folklorists reference it, and travelers sometimes pause before choosing their routes through the mountains, remembering old warnings that might not be entirely legend. The tale of the Onibaba, as recorded by an unnamed merchant who survived her cave, remains one of the collection's most detailed and chilling entries. Decades after the merchant's death, a group of monks decided to undertake a pilgrimage through the high mountain passes, seeking to reclaim and restore the abandoned shrines. They had read the accounts of travelers disappearing, had studied the folklore collected by scholars, and believed that their prayers and protective rituals could cleanse the mountain of its darkness. They were young and fervent, convinced that spiritual purity would shield them from supernatural harm. The journey started well. The monks had prepared extensively for their pilgrimage, studying old texts and consulting with elders who remembered the mountain's reputation. They carried protective talismans blessed by senior priests, prayer beads carved from wood taken from sacred trees, and scrolls inscribed with sutras known for their power against malevolent spirits. Each monk had undergone purification rituals before departure, fasting and meditating to strengthen their spiritual defenses. Their leader was a man named Kenshin, 40 years old, and respected for both his learning and his practical wisdom. He had not risen to his position through mere study, but through demonstrated ability to navigate the complexities of both spiritual and mundane worlds. When younger monks spoke with certainty about the supremacy of faith over fear, Kenshin tempered their enthusiasm with reminders that respect for danger was not the same as cowardice, that caution could coexist with courage. It was Kenshin who recognized the dwelling for what it was, even through the fog and despite the decades that had passed since the merchant's account was written. The location matched, the isolation was consistent, and most tellingly, the fog itself felt unnatural, too thick and too persistent to be simple weather. When the old woman emerged, Kenshin saw past the facade immediately, his years of training and observation allowing him to notice the small inconsistencies that marked her as something other than human. The monks climbed steadily through the lower slopes, chanting sutras and marking their passage with prayers. They found the first abandoned shrine, a small structure in better condition than expected, and spent 2 days cleaning it, replacing the rotted wood, recarving the protective symbols into the stone. They felt the satisfaction of holy work, the pride of serving a greater purpose. As they climbed higher, though, the journey became more difficult. Fog rolled in, thick and persistent, limiting visibility to a few feet. The temperature dropped sharply, and their robes, adequate for the lowlands, provided insufficient protection against the mountain's cold. They huddled together for warmth at night, their fires struggling against the wind, and pushed forward each day with increasing weariness. On the 5th day, they reached a plateau where the fog was particularly dense. One of the younger monks, scouting ahead, called back that he had found a dwelling, a place where they could shelter and rest. The leader of the group felt a prick of unease at these words, remembering the merchant's account, but rationalized it away. Many hermits lived in these mountains, not all of them supernatural threats. And they were monks, protected by their faith, armed with holy words and sacred symbols. They approached the dwelling, and an old woman emerged to greet them. She was bent and ancient, her face weathered by mountain winds, but her voice was welcoming. She invited them inside, promising tea and warmth, and the monks, cold and exhausted, accepted gratefully. The leader maintained his caution, though, positioning himself near the door and watching his host carefully as she prepared refreshments. The tea she served smelled wrong, bitter with undertones of decay. The leader caught the youngest monk's wrist before he could drink and shook his head minutely. The old woman's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, the leader saw something else behind her human mask, something ancient and hungry. He stood abruptly, thanking her for the hospitality, but insisting they needed to continue their journey while daylight remained. The old woman's protest was immediate and vehement. The fog was too thick, she insisted. The paths too dangerous. They should rest here, sleep, recover their strength. Her voice rose in pitch and volume, taking on a quality that seemed to bypass their ears and resonate directly in their skulls. Several of the monks swayed, their eyes glazing over, but the leader began chanting a protective sutra, his voice strong and clear. The other monks joined him, their voices rising in harmony, and the power of the ancient words filled the small dwelling. The old woman recoiled as if struck. Her form flickered, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath, the gray skin and 2 long limbs, the teeth that gleamed in the firelight. The leader raised his prayer beads, holding them like a weapon, and commanded her in the name of the Buddha to release them. For a long moment, the outcome hung in balance. Then, with a shriek that made the timbers of the dwelling shake, she fled, disappearing into the back of the structure where shadows pooled thick and impenetrable. The monks did not wait. They gathered their belongings and ran into the fog, trusting their leader's sense of direction and the protection of their faith. They heard her behind them, heard her rage echoing across the rocks, but they did not stop or look back. They ran until exhaustion forced them to halt, and even then they maintained their prayers, creating a circle of protection with their bodies and voices. They survived the night and continued their pilgrimage, though with renewed caution and respect for the mountain's dangers. When they returned to the lowlands weeks later, they reported their encounter to the temple elders, and additional warnings were issued. The high paths were formally declared forbidden to solitary travelers, and those who insisted on using them were advised to travel only in groups, armed with prayers and protective talismans. The mountain stands still beneath its crown of mist, and in its highest reaches, where the air grows thin and the stones remember ages before human time, the dwelling endures. The Onibaba may dwell there still, or perhaps she is moved to some other hunting ground, following the scent of human travelers to new territories. No one ventures there to confirm, and perhaps that is wise. The story persists, though, passed down through generations, transformed by each telling, yet maintaining its essential truth. Parents use it to warn children away from dangerous paths. Travelers share it around evening fires, their voices dropping to whispers as they speak of the kindly old woman whose hospitality conceals horror. Scholars document it, adding new accounts to the old, building a record that spans centuries. And sometimes, when the fog rolls thick through the mountain passes, when the wind carries sounds that might be voices calling, travelers report seeing a dwelling where none should exist, seeing smoke rising from a hidden valley, hearing offers of warmth and shelter. Most turn away, remembering the warnings, but occasionally one does not, drawn by exhaustion or skepticism or simple misfortune into that ancient trap. The mountain remembers everything. It remembers the merchant who escaped by luck and magic. It remembers the monks who drove back darkness with prayer. It remembers all those who did not survive, whose bones lie in caves beneath the stone, testimony to hunger that endures beyond mortal understanding. And it will remember you, listener, should you ever find yourself on those high trails, should you ever hear a voice promising rest in the wilderness. Be wary of kindness in places where kindness should not exist. Question hospitality that comes too easily in harsh terrain. Trust your instincts when they whisper warnings in the language of fear. The Onibaba's tale is not just history, but present reality, not just story, but continuing truth. The demon hag endures, patient as stone, waiting for the next traveler who ignores the warnings, who believes themselves beyond the reach of old magic and ancient hunger. The mountain stands beneath the stars, eternal and watching, and somewhere in its heights, a voice calls through the mist, offering shelter to those who have lost their way. In modern times, when fewer people believe in yokai and most travelers take highways that bypass the old mountain paths entirely, the dwelling stands empty more often than not. Seasons pass unmarked, snow accumulating on the sagging roof in winter, spring rains washing away the traces of occasional visitors. The cave behind remains undisturbed, its contents slowly settling deeper into the earth, becoming part of the mountain's geological record. But empty does not mean abandoned. The Onibaba, if she still exists, has learned patience measured in lifetimes rather than seasons. She can wait decades between meals, entering states of hibernation that blur the line between life and death, her metabolism slowing to near stillness until the vibrations of approaching footsteps wake her hunger. Some folklorists theorize that there may be multiple such creatures scattered across different mountain ranges, each one a remnant of an older age when the boundary between human and yokai was more permeable, when transformation was not metaphor but literal possibility. The merchant's account spawned imitators over the years, with various travelers claiming their own encounters with demon hags or other mountain spirits. Some of these accounts are genuine. Others are fabrications, seeking attention or attempting to explain away more mundane tragedies. The challenge for scholars is separating authentic folklore from modern invention, distinguishing between experiences that carry the weight of truth and stories crafted for entertainment or profit. Yet certain details recur across multiple accounts with enough consistency to suggest underlying reality. The bitter tea appears in several independent narratives. The Cave of Bones is described by sources separated by decades and hundreds of miles. The transformation from kindly host to predatory creature follows similar patterns in accounts that show no evidence of cross-contamination. These commonalities suggest either a shared cultural template for describing such encounters or multiple genuine experiences with similar entities. The question of the Onibaba's origins remains unanswered. Was she human once, transformed by circumstance, or curse into her current state? Is she a natural spirit of the mountain, as much a part of the landscape as the stones and pines? Could she be something older still, A remnant from ages before human civilization spread across these lands? The answers, if they exist, remain hidden in the mountain's silence. What persists is the warning, transmitted now not just through oral tradition, but through written accounts, through digital archives, through the multiple layers of communication that define modern society. The message remains constant. Beware kindness in the wilderness. Question hospitality that appears too conveniently. Trust instinct over politeness when something feels wrong. And perhaps that is the story's ultimate purpose, not to chronicle a specific creature or event, but to encode survival wisdom in memorable form. The Onibaba represents all the dangers that wear friendly faces, all the threats that exploit human needs for shelter and connection. Her tale teaches vigilance without paranoia, caution without cowardice, the ability to recognize danger even when it comes wrapped in kindness. So sleep, listener, but sleep with the knowledge that monsters may be myths, but the lessons they teach are timeless. The mountain stands eternal. The fog rolls through its passes, and somewhere in the heights, a voice may still call through the mist, offering rest to the weary, sustenance to the hungry, warmth to the cold. And to those few who hear that call and follow it into the gray, the mountain offers no judgment, only continuation of a pattern as old as hunger itself, as enduring as stone.